Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Cathleen King, and today I'm going to be reading from my blog, Rewiring Your Brain During Grief. The experience of grief and loss, it's one of the most difficult aspects of being human. It's especially difficult when we're already struggling with chronic illness or trauma patterns, and then the death of a loved one occurs simultaneously. I want to speak to this issue as it seems like more than a normal amount of my clients and community members and friends have been going through the process of grief while trying to rewire their brain and find healing from chronic illness. First, please know that grief is not a negative emotion that must be rewired. Grief is a natural and normal physiological and emotional response and is a healthy reaction to loss. I've come across some wacky ideas from those in the rewiring community that they need to rewire their grief and do away with it. Grief is not a limbic impairment. It is a response by the brain that is trying to make sense of how to understand what has happened. Grief is a process of learning, and we must include it, not focus on resolving it. The brain is being asked to understand how to conceptualize where this person still exists. It's a shock to the psyche in some ways to try to understand how to be okay when that person is no longer living. I think this is a process of teaching the brain that the person is not living, but the love for the person never leaves. And furthermore, the energetic and spiritual connection is eternal. So the brain is learning that love lasts, even though there is sadness and absence. This is a real paradox for the brain, and that is why the process of acceptance and processing grief does take time. Also know that traumatic loss can actually be experienced much like a brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder. Traumatic loss can trigger deep protection mechanisms in the brain and limbic system as loss is perceived as a threat to survival. This creates a flood of emotions and results in neuroplastic changes in the brain. The typical brain firing patterns are interrupted, and new, usually temporary, brain firing patterns form that can cause a host of debilitating symptoms. These symptoms of grief can include brain fog, tiredness, forgetfulness, disassociation, sleep disturbance, immune dysregulation, heart changes, dysautonomia, and more. This can result in a chronic stress response if grief is not met and processed. And yet, this grief is a normal protective process. In other words, these symptoms are not wrong, but they are uncomfortable. Grief and depression are different, but they often feel the same. I see grief as different from depression. Why? Because a depressed person feels deeply discouraged, sad, hopeless, even when those that love them are still around them. A truly depressed person is depressed whether or not the person they lost would come back into their life. Grief-based depression, on the other hand, is due to the mind not being able to accept what has happened fully, and that the brain hasn't learned how to move forward and come back into life. If the deceased person were to suddenly come back to life, I think their depression would end. How to work with grief. First, look at the ancient way of grief rituals. We are not wired to heal grief alone, and the ancient cultures understood this. Grief was a community event, not a personal event. This is huge. We are wired to grieve together. We are wired to wail and scream and shout and cry together as a tribe. We have lost that ritual. Many modern cultures have lost the capacity to appropriately somatically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually process their grief. Find a grief circle or create one in your life of those who are burdened by loss. Learn about ancient grief rituals and seek to reenact them. Learn about the death wail and find your own way to do this, ideally with others. And at the very least, find some supportive friends who are able to hold space and listen to what this process has been like for you. Second, recognize the sacred spiritual process you are going through. Find books that help you create your own grief rituals, such as the Good Grief Ritual book by Elaine Childs Gowell. This book was helpful to me in my processing of grief. There are others as well. Find a way to make the process rich with ceremony. Take the time to journal, process, and be with yourself and fully express all of the emotions, the thoughts, and the feelings. This allows your brain to consciously see all that is happening so that it can learn to catch up with the current reality and begin to go through the process of acceptance. Next, find a way to somatically express grief. The body wants to weep and wail, shout and scream. Do it. Let your body speak and move the energy. And then find grounding and self compassion for the body and its experience. Remember to do your best to love yourself enough to eat well, to sleep as best you can, and move your body daily, outside, ideally in the sun. Grief doesn't go away. Your memory of loss will be with you. Grief does become included, however, in your experience, and therefore doesn't take up all of your brain space as you go through the process of acceptance. Brain retraining while experiencing grief. In the brain retraining world, we are told to elevate our mood and visualize a positive future. Well, this can be difficult during grief. And it's also important to teach the brain that there isn't danger happening so the brain can calm down after the loss of a loved one. I recommend still trying to do some uplifting practices daily, whether it's brain retraining, time with friends, watching funny movies, walking in nature, etc. And also be realistic in what your visualizations are, as it might be more about just being calm or feeling connected or enjoying nature rather than, yay, life is so much fun right now. So take a moderate approach that is not discounting your current experience of grief. That being said, it doesn't mean to let grief take you into a hole. Try to have a container time to really grieve. For example, I'm going to take the next 20 minutes and really let myself cry, shout, move, grieve, and then I'm going to go for a nice walk or make myself a cup of tea and read a book I enjoy. In other words, it's about finding balance between processing grief and also showing your brain that there is still a life to live that can be satisfying. We must learn to hold the tensions of the opposites. I am sad, and yet I'm still here to live a life. I miss them, yet their love is still with me. I don't want life to go on without them, yet there's still life calling me to live. And know that in time, your brain will learn how to have a new relationship with your loved one. And that and that'll help acceptance to be coming in a more spiritual and help you to understand that there's more of a spiritual and energetic connection now. And that helps you to have the capacity to continue to have gratitude for the physical connection of the past. For those that are grieving now, may you take a moment to feel the eternal connection to the one you love that cannot be taken. Love is eternal. May you learn to hold these tensions of the opposites and find a new life ahead while including the grief of this moment. Thank you for listening.